A world exists beyond that mundane little life that you live in. A world where intelligence is worshipped and pilots are God. A world filled with biotechnology that can save lives or end them.
A war is brewing beneath the surface of everything you understand to be real. Ours is a tale of revenge, love, and desperate ambition. Will you come with us?
I see you standing there, straight in an arrogance what I wouldn't give to tear you down.
Welcome to episode 6 of Interface, the Creator's Champion. We're your hosts, Ellie Popov
and Charles Jazz Terrier. Low listener, what are we waiting for?
Tango waves around your neck will hang you out to dry. Tango waves around your neck will hang you out to dry.
Even from the darkness, the lights of the city glowed, filling Frey's vision from her spot against the alley wall a fair distance from the entrance of the circuit warehouse. Frey had wrapped herself within the night's shadow, trying to make sense of Wyatt's loss. Trying to rally herself, Frey's hands rubbed the back of her neck, ebbing the tenseness away from the muscles layered beneath the skin, mildly slick with summer sweat. Absent-mindedly, her fingers twisted up into her hair and caught on the tiny button-sized metal implant within its masses. Upon contact with the foreign device, Frey's hands recoiled and dropped away. From the far end of the alleyway, Jasper emerged, in his hands clasping a cardboard box, expression all business. As he strode towards her, he ripped open the box and pulled out a mobile phone from its packaging, wordlessly tossing it to Frey, who caught it in one hand. Jasper dipped into his coat pocket and revealed a SIM card which he waggled tauntingly at Frey before holding it out for her to take. But Frey was in no mood. She glared and frowned, her eyes boring into Jasper's. The soldier just quirked a brow at her. Hey, you're train wreck, you're making the call. Though Jasper's words stung, she couldn't deny that she had made the wrong choice. Whether it was Wyatt's failure, Tempest's sabotage, or that Frey's instincts had failed her so severely, Frey knew she was responsible for their current situation, and now she'd have to face up for it. Frey snatched the SIM card from Jasper's hand and propped it into the side of the phone with such ferocity that Jasper backed away from her, moving to the opposite wall of the alley, and shoved his hands into his pockets. Frey dialed the number, recalling it by heart, and braced herself with a long exhale before lifting the phone to her ear. Circa 1, Echo, Charlie, Alpha. Frey rattled off clearly into the mouthpiece, every inch of her buzzing in expectation. A monotone computer-generated voice greeted her.
Vocal recognition complete.
The phone line began to ring. 1 second, 2, the line clicked, opened, and Frey spoke first, trying to maintain some control over the situation and his reaction. The results came through. How did the potential fare? Julian's smooth British voice sounded through the receiver, erupting in the memory of his intelligent almond eyes and clear Chinese complexion. It had been a long time since Frey had seen him in person. The man who had been both boss and father figure, or at least the only kind of father she'd ever known. Frey kept her voice matter-of-fact. No placement was recorded. A moment of silence hung thick between them, and Freya imagined Julian sitting behind his glass desk, looking out at his own view of the Gold Coast city lights, scanning the buildings as if he could track her. No placement, Julian finally questioned. Well, after the promising training statistics and glowing review, I can safely say that I share in the disappointment you must be feeling. Julian paused there, and Frey knew that he was punishing her with his silence, letting her stew on his next move that would shape all of their futures. She stayed quiet, letting him play his game. What are our options to fill the quota? A layer of tension lifted at Julian's words. He was going to let them try again. "We'll open for more potentials," she replied. "Keep looking." "Not ideal, though, is it?" Julian countered. "No, sir." From his spot against the alley wall, Jasper stared at Frey with bright eyes, trying to read the outcome, but she gave nothing away. Frey was still hesitant, waiting for the catch. But Julian only said, "I know you'll do your best." "Yes, sir." Another pause passed between them before Julian said, "Keep an eye on the clock." He hung up swiftly, leaving his threat ringing in Frey's ears. Unable to avoid Jasper's gaze any longer, she met his stare, the resounding beeping from the phone fading as she held it out to him. Jasper read her expression before he took the phone and popped the SIM card out, crushing it between his fingers, until they both heard the satisfying snap of plastic. "We're still screwed," Jasper said pointedly, before Frey could say anything. "We'll just keep looking." Frey was beginning to feel like a broken record, repeating the phrase to convince herself of its power as much as everyone else. "Sure, yeah, it'll work out," he snapped sarcastically. "Maybe your program can find us a little flying piggy, too." Frustration felt like it began to boil within her very blood. Yeah, Jasper was pissed, but so was she. They were both in this fucking situation, and Jasper's little alpha wanker remarks weren't helping anything. "Do you have to be such a sarcastic prick?" she rounded on him. "If you have a better solution, spare me the theatrics, please." Frey pushed off the wall and began pacing, hoping the physical movement would help burn off some of her tempered energy. Jasper countered, practically spitting at her. "Don't look at me. You're supposed to be the one with the brains." At that, Frey stopped mid-pace and spun on her heel to face him. "I can take this moment to remind you that if you had kept your dick out of this, we probably wouldn't be in this mess to begin with." Beneath her venomous stare, Jasper's face burnt. She knew she was pushing him close to his edge. It was a shot below the belt, but lately the tensions between the two of them were rising, their bond drifting further apart as Jasper grew more resentful of their situation, his situation, and he blamed her. But for Frey, Jasper was family. And she was just as fucked as he was if they didn't pull this off. She wasn't going to let him take this shit out on her. Jasper inched up to her, his fury-filled eyes boring into her own. "Oh, you want to point fingers, do you? That's really going to help." "Well, castration comes to mind as a good preventative step to avoid future calamity," Jasper faltered, the reference to his penis tweaking at his sense of humor. Frey caught the physical shift in his expression. After a moment, he said, practically whispering, "Too far." His face broke into an ill-contained smile that he struggled to ward off. Frey's own face mirrored Jasper's, and the two smiled at each other, tensions easing between them. They shared a look of common understanding before Jasper tossed the broken mobile phone into the nearby dumpster. The two began moving back towards the circuit games in unison, to retrieve Wyatt.
The city skyline glittered brightly against the darkness of the night through the massive glass windows that surrounded Julian's office, and he looked out across the escarpment of buildings at mixed heights and architectural aesthetics as he considered his last words to Frey. The last piece of advice he could let linger in her ear, words to urge her on. "Keep an eye on the clock," he said firmly. Then he promptly hung up the phone and placed it back into his jacket pocket. Frey had promised him that her team would prevail, and God knew they needed things to work out. They would have to find another champion, and they would have to find one now. Julian knew that somehow, Frey had always found a way through to the top. As a child, she had never taken no for an answer. Never let anyone shuttle her into a box because of her age or gender. She'd gone above and beyond to prove her intellect, to prove her worth to the organization she'd pledged her loyalty to. She had grown to accomplish unimaginable things, to prove her worth to him. Julian had pushed her every step of the way, and he'd known that this time more than ever, he'd had to push her again, for all their sakes. From the doorway to his office, a shadow slunk into the light, revealing the handsome face of Finn, his third in command. 2 children Julian had taken from the rubble of that Eastern European village little more than 20 years ago. 2 children he'd groomed and cultivated, nurturing their intellect, their resilience, and their obedience. From Julian's nest emerged 2 strong, useful, fully developed human beings, Frey and Finn, as different in personality and aesthetic as night and day. Perfectly developed members of the organization, members he could trust with a common goal: his own agenda. Finn strode through the room, and at Julian's nod seated himself opposite Julian on the other side of the desk. As he settled himself, Julian watched the cityscape glint through the strands of Finn's blonde hair. Finn was fair, where Freya was dark, lightly tanned against Freya's deep olive complexion, lithe and leanly muscled in comparison to Frey's hourglass figure. No, you'd never guess the 2 had been found in the same village, or that they'd been raised practically as siblings. Concerned green eyes searched Julian's, awaiting his command. When none came, Finn asked, "What are the orders, sir? Is the operation to be terminated?" Julian turned a calm face on Finn. Not yet. Across the desk, Finn's shoulders relaxed as he settled, knowing that there was nothing further required of him tonight. Julian's lion, ready to do whatever he ordered, whatever it took. Beyond the van, Wyatt could hear the silence of the streets, a juxtaposition against the humming of the vehicle. Seated in the gloom towards the rear of the machine, he glanced around at the also silent faces of Frey, Jasper, and Fergus, who situated around him. Issiah operating the vehicle alone at the front. Time and time again during their journey, Wyatt had tried to draw the team into conversation with no reply. Instead, they'd looked on mutely, at the floor, at each other, avoiding his gaze. Though Wyatt had asked point blank about their destination when he'd been pushed into the vehicle, each of them had ignored him. Wyatt had no idea where he was going, or what was going to happen to him, and he'd lost track of time, each minute passing riddled with tension but leaving no way for Wyatt to measure it from behind the blacked-out windows of the van. Far into the journey, Wyatt noticed the repetition of reduced speed, turned corners, and lots of stopping and starting. He guessed that they were somewhere built up, which he hoped meant they were heading back towards base. Maybe they meant for him to stay with them. Maybe they meant to kill him there. After his loss today, Wyatt wasn't sure he actually cared if they did away with him. After having a taste of the circuit games, of Frey's lips, of being seen, he didn't know if he'd actually be able to survive on his own again. Suddenly, the vehicle rolled to a stop. Jasper lurched forward, rolled open the side door, and clambered out, with a surprising amount of grace. He reached back around and lashed his big hands onto Wyatt's neck, yanking him out of the van and into the dimly lit street beside him. Wyatt's feet hit concrete pavement and he stumbled back, catching his balance. Inside the van, Frey, Fergus, and Issiah remained seated, still avoiding his gaze. Wyatt glanced around at the street. Familiarity seeped through his disorientation and his stomach rolled, both with relief and surging panic. They'd brought him home. Jasper reached back into the van and tossed a duffel bag in Wyatt's direction. It hit his chest and tumbled to the ground, like a fiery coil unraveling inside him. Wyatt felt himself spark in anger. His desperation drove his confidence. "What, that's it? Just like that?" "Yeah, kid, that's it." Jasper barely looked at him and moved as if to get back in the van, and that's when it really hit Wyatt. They were going to leave him here. This was no tactic, no joke, no punishment. It was over. He was over. The air was thick with the humid heat of the night, and Wyatt felt it strangle him. His heart thumped loudly in his ears, and his voice caught in his throat as Wyatt waited for someone to say something. Wondered if he should say something. But all that filled the night was the chirping of crickets from suburban bushes and Wyatt's betraying heartbeat. Jasper started to climb back into the van. Wyatt started. "Give me another shot, please." His begging caught Jasper's attention, but he turned tired, hard eyes on Wyatt. "She wasn't even supposed to be matched against me. She rigged it." "Yeah, she did. You got a rough deal. I get it." Jasper's voice was like a wall Wyatt's pleas couldn't penetrate. But it's done, he choked. Wyatt threw his hands up before him in parley. I know I did, okay? But if you could just give me another shot, he scanned Jasper's eyes, looking for a way through. I know what I did was wrong, and I'll be able to correct it. Jasper didn't budge. Wyatt shifted his view over the top of Jasper's shoulder, singling out Frey, still silent in the back of the van. Frey. Please. Wyatt refused to believe Frey would end things like this. That connection, that chemistry between them was something. Surely if he could just get her to focus on him. After what seemed like an eternity, Frey finally turned her steel gaze on Wyatt. But all Wyatt received was blankness. Frey might as well have been watching a dog shit. Jasper glanced between them, his understanding clear. Sorry, kid. We were rooting for you. He clambered fully into the vehicle as Wyatt helplessly watched on. Issiah kept his face forward, ready to kick the van back into motion. But Fergus's face was twisted in devastation. He raised a hand and gave Wyatt an awkward wave as Jasper rolled the side door shut. Wyatt laid a hand onto the cold metal door, an unfathomable wall between them. Come on, no! Wait, please! The van engine turned over, confirming the team's intention to exit Wyatt's life. Wyatt stepped back from the curb just in time for their van to lurch forward and speed down the road, turning the corner out of sight. Wyatt's body bubbled with anxiety, and he doubled over, feeling the pull of nausea. After a couple of ineffective heaves, he straightened up and faced the darkened mass of his house. He took a deep breath and exhaled slowly, before picking up the duffel bag from the sidewalk and making his way to the front door. That earlier sense of numbness began to creep back through his veins, soothing the pain of their rejection. Wyatt shook the duffel bag, and when an answering jangle of keys greeted him, he plunged his hand inside, grasping around until he wrapped his fingers around the cold metal. He twisted the key in the door's lock, swung it open, and stepped inside. He flicked on the hall light. Wyatt's home looked just like he left it, though he could smell the scent of rotting garbage lingering in the air from where he left a full bin in the kitchen. He knew there was likely a maggot infestation by now, but Wyatt couldn't bring himself to reintegrate into his responsibilities just yet. Instead, he made a beeline for the couch and flopped down, staring at a spot on the wall illuminated by the harsh fluorescent ceiling light in his lounge room. The familiar, cheap fabric dipped under his weight, and he leaned back against the cushions. Wyatt was finally home, and though it had been little more than a week since Issiah had taken him under the guise of a blood-dripping panda mask, it felt like he'd lived a lifetime since he'd last been here. Tendrils of uninvited sunlight spread its beams through Wyatt's partially blocked-out window, entering Wyatt's line of sight from where he sat on the edge of his bed. He'd purposely poised himself opposite his computer desk, glaring at the screen, willing it to find something, any little trace of them. After Wyatt had picked himself up off the couch in the early hours of the morning, he'd headed straight into his bedroom, pushed the rotting leftovers of Chinese takeout that still cluttered his desk from before the kidnapping out of the way to start running tracing programs on Frey's hack. He'd been at it a couple of hours before he'd been stumped, Frey's trail cold. Frey had outwitted him. She'd left him with nothing, with not even the remnants of a false VPN. When Wyatt's eyes began to burn, he moved to his bed and laid down, hoping for sleep to consume him, to give him some rest so that he could recommence his search with fresh, focused eyes. But Wyatt's heart had kept pounding, that pit in his stomach burrowed deeper, and the projection of Frey, Jasper, Issiah, and Fergus unequivocally sunk beneath his skin. They'd left him behind. They weren't coming back. When Wyatt had finally accepted that sleep had evaded him, he'd moved to a sitting position, his eyes back on the monitor, watching the tracing program move through its operation numbly. They kidnapped him, tortured him, then they trained him. They'd elevated him and made him feel like he was worth something. They dangled his mother's records in his face along with the promise of glory. For fuck's sake, they'd give him Wyatt a week? A week where others had had months, likely years of training to become a circuit champion, and in a week, Wyatt surpassed almost all others. In a week, he'd set a new circuit record, and still they'd thrown him away. Wyatt could feel the pounding of his heart hasten painfully in his chest. The tension seeping through his veins. He wanted to curl in on himself. He wanted to cry, to have tasted a woman like Frey, to have been so close to everything Wyatt had ever wanted, and to have lost it because of his own weakness, his own lacking. The pounding in Wyatt's chest started to thud. A thudding in his ears, a partial replication of the underground electronic house music that blared through the circuit games. Wyatt remembered the feel of Frey's lips on his own, her coy smile as she walked out of the room after kissing him, after showing Wyatt she believed in him. Her exotic face transformed into Tempest's gloating smile as she'd paraded around inside the arena in victory after Wyatt's loss, after his absolute annihilation. Wyatt hadn't even really managed to put up a fight. The vision of Tempest morphed into the faces of Jasper, Issiah, and Fergus as they dumped him on the gutter outside his house. His eyes closed on Frey's blank, hard stare. Wyatt opened them, gaze downcast on his lap, hands gripping on the edge of the bed. A black marking on one hand caught his eye. The smiling face Frey had drawn on Wyatt's skin before the placement round had begun. His breath caught in his throat. He'd choked. Wyatt couldn't stand it anymore. A sudden, uncontainable rage filled him like a Category 5 cyclone. He lurched up onto his feet and stormed over to the computer desk, as Wyatt ripped the keyboard from the desk surface and flung it across the room, watching it as it hit the bedroom wall with a loud crunch, dinting the gyprock beneath. The violence fed his inner turmoil, and Wyatt backhanded the rest of the desk's occupants roughly, listening as each item hit the ground, smashing, splintering, or crashing. It wasn't enough. He wasn't enough. Wyatt let out a guttural, blood-curdling yell. He yelled until his voice gave out to a raspy crackling and his throat was aching and raw. And Wyatt knew then that he had even failed at that.
The drive back to base had taken little more than an hour, but to Frey it seemed like days. That last look that Wyatt had sent her away, that pleading desperation, the trust that she wouldn't abandon him. It had left her shaken. It had taken an immense strength to leave Wyatt on the sidewalk. But Frey had no choice. He had shown such promise, yes, but Jasper was right. He choked, and he'd disappointed her. More importantly, Wyatt's failure would have severe consequences on them all if Frey and Jasper couldn't find a replacement. Wyatt's loss had left them open, vulnerable, and she couldn't forgive that, couldn't turn back for him. She could only race forward. After all, the clock was ticking. They reached the base in hours before dawn and filtered into the boarded warehouse, isolated from prying eyes by the last promise of night. Wordlessly, Frey, Jasper, Issiah, and Fergus congregated in the training room, situating themselves in various places, all four averting their gaze from Wyatt's pilot station, still set up in the center of the room. Once Frey had flung herself into a desk chair, she spoke, breaking the silence between them. Orders are orders. There was no need for further explanation. They'd been down this road time and time again. Fergus had settled himself in the far corner, but on the hard floor, back against the wall. "Will be required to change location again?" he asked. Frey nodded. Jasper sat by the computer station, already sifting through profiles of collected contenders they'd vetoed in favor of Wyatt, at Frey's insistence. "This is bullshit. This whole life is bullshit." Jasper smacked his hand against the desk, his temper tantrum causing the keyboard and mouse to clang against the desktop. Fergus jumped, startled by the violence, but Frey just hardened further. "Maybe, but we're almost over the line." Issiah, stoic in his guard positioned by the door, nodded in agreeance. Jasper exhaled. Frey knew that he knew she was right. They had no choice but to keep going. Fergus moved from his position to stand by the pilot station, his eyes downcast in disappointment. Frey hadn't realized how deeply he'd grown attached to Wyatt. It was a first for Fergus. Frey rose from the chair and made her way over to him, placing a hand on his shoulder in a gesture of comfort. Surprisingly, Fergus stepped away from her. Frey felt a painful sting in her chest. Did Fergus blame her like Jasper did? She swallowed the pain down, carefully arranging her expression. "Let's pack it up." Without further discussion, the bodies around her moved into gear, heading to their separate quarters, as if on autopilot. The team worked together quietly to empty the building of necessary belongings, piling them into the van. They brought only the barest of essentials, an annoyance each time they had to shift again to start afresh, a consequence that left them feeling something less than human. The sky was still blue with night by the time they deserted the base, the sun just beginning to bloom into the sky like a chariot of fire racing higher and higher. Frey, Jasper, Issiah, and Fergus managed to fit into the vehicle with some difficulty, squeezing in between the items they'd packed to go with them. Issiah and Fergus were nestled into the back whilst Jasper drove. Frey was tucked into the passenger seat with an open laptop resting on her knees. The low morale of her team was evident, and Frey couldn't blame them. She didn't feel much better herself. The screen of Frey's laptop changed. A timer started to spin in its center. Frey broke the silence. They're patching through the next location now. It's bouncing through the servers. Looks like we'll have it in an hour. Jasper grunted in response. This stuff could travel at the speed of light if they wanted it to. Keeping us waiting for an hour after an all-nighter sounds like Julian's idea of consequence to me. Frey couldn't deny it was just Julian's style. "Well, you piss off Daddy and he's bound to ground us," she stated. Fergus's head emerged beside Frey from the back of the van. He leant forward into Frey's seat. "Pardon me," Fergus interjected, "but if we are waiting on confirmation, might I suggest breakfast? I'm in need of a crumpet and a hot cup of tea." Frey heard Jasper's stomach growl from the driver's side. Hunger was probably contributing to his irritability. She wasn't surprised when the soldiers sided with Fergus. "That's the smartest idea you've ever had, Fergus. Except for the crumpets. I need bacon. And bourbon." The timer on the loading screen continued to spin achingly slow. Instead of figuratively watching the paint dry, Frey maximized the program she designed for finding their potential pilots. With a tap of a key, Pilot Seeker activated. New candidates and data flashed across the screen as the search scanner worked through the variables available through the preset filtering process. The myriad of faces brought Frey the first sparks of comfort in the hours since Wyatt lost round 1 to Tempest. She would find another pilot, a better pilot. She wouldn't let her team down. Frey smiled, beginning to feel the outer layer of tension ebb away. You can both have whatever you want, as long as there's coffee.
The artificial light of Wyatt's monitors bathed Wyatt and the small space around his desk in an eerie white glow. Still dressed in his work clothes from the day before, Wyatt's bloodshot eyes were glued to his many screens as he hacked into traffic surveillance cameras and their footage banks located within a 100-kilometer radius of his home. Wyatt's return to existence to the real world had only been so for a handful of days, though already he'd had to resume his mind-numbing service at Lion Insurance, a source of finance being the key problem. His first steps back into the office after his time with Frey, Jasper, and the circuit games had been like embarking on a passage into hell. Like the moment he'd walked through those doors, there was no turning back. He was stuck, trapped. And worse still, each day away from Frey, Jasper, Fergus, and Issiah had plagued his mind with the nagging nightmare that he'd made the whole thing up. The kidnapping, the circuit games, Frey's lips. A fantasy founded on desperation. Only the fading remnants of the sketched, smiling ink face on his hand and the physical evidence of the device Wyatt had managed to swipe from the circuit game's terminator. The fan who'd been dangerously high on ground cloud reassured Wyatt that his memories weren't in fact a mental breakdown. The crown-like device was laid out on the desk before Wyatt, in amongst a tangle of cables. He'd been trying to fit the plugs of each of the miscellaneous cables into the device's only port, so far with little success. Wyatt's central monitor flashed through the traffic surveillance of a never-ending list of vans approximately the same size and build as the one that belonged to his kidnappers. His eyes narrowed as he chewed on his lip thoughtfully, watching the program flick through each one. Something in Wyatt's mind sparked. He opened up a coding window and typed in the combination VXY373, vaguely recalling the number plate of the van before it had abandoned him on the curb and sped off into the night. The memory of being dumped onto the sidewalk still stung. Wyatt punched enter and leaned back to watch multiple vehicles appear, one after the other with variations of numbers or digits from the memorized number plates. Some minutes went by before Wyatt finally caught sight of a familiar black van within the footage. His program began to confirm the plates, first a letter at a time and then digit by digit. Before the program could confirm the variable, the numbers and letters scrambled, sending Wyatt's program into a repeat action. Wyatt's eyes went wide. Any hint of fatigue removed the acquirement of the first clue in days. He'd found them, confirmed by the diversion security coded onto the number plate readings through the surveillance footage. A less desperate man would have missed it. Very clever, Wyatt breathed. He paused for a moment before punching in another request into his coding window. This time he directed the program to scan for all the plate letters and numbers except the last. He watched in satisfaction as the program received a small return of hits and instantly banked the data. A swift analysis allowed the program to begin to triangulate a location. Overtly pleased with himself, Wyatt smiled. He picked up his nearby mobile phone and synced it to his computer. He left the program running as he pocketed the stolen circuit device, grabbed his keys, and made for the door. Click, click, click. The tips of Julian's fingers tapped impatiently against the cold gray stone of the boardroom table as Julian thought of how much he wished that Wyatt boy hadn't completely and utterly failed first round into the games. Then, he wouldn't have been subjected to the bickering between his staff that was taking place this morning. Spread around the table where Julian sat at its head was Thea on the right, Lucian at the table's foot, and Lawrence to Julian's left. Their skills and expertise as heads of their designated departments rendered these agents indispensable, and unfortunately, each of the three had their own agenda, and each were well aware of Frey and Jasper's misstep at the circuit games. Lawrence, a solidly built, tall South African-American man, was a former commander. He'd worked relentlessly within the confines of secret U.S. military co-op missions with a specialized involvement in the brutal ongoing coups and rebellions that had ravaged the landlocked country of Africa. Likewise, he'd led several high-risk covert military operations in the Middle East before earning the right to join the ranks of the Armed Forces Organization. Normally, Julian believed that on the ground, military men were a dime a dozen, to put it bluntly. Not necessarily a skilled desire to be selected for the AFO. Especially now that Lawrence had entered his 50s. But Lawrence was highly intelligent, tactful, resourceful, almost like the organization's own Sun Tzu. Lawrence knew the art of war and he knew it well. Early on, however, Julian had discovered that Lawrence's Achilles heel was his moral compass. Oftentimes in strategy meetings, Julian had found himself head-to-head with the commander, as did others. But Lawrence had always stood his ground when it came to the value of human life. Julian, too, believed that the value of human life was a priority of the Armed Forces Organization. Where they disagreed was in how to execute that value, where to draw the line, exactly. Lawrence was a man who believed that one life was just as important as 100, whereas Julian would easily save the 100 for the loss of one. It was only logical. Thea, a dark-haired Middle Eastern beauty strikingly preserved, despite being on the cusp of middle age, was arguing for her right to proceed with the Crown Technology bid after the calamity of the circuit. Dressed in a feminine light gray corporate skirt suit, Julian could see how she'd been so easily underestimated in her past corporate environments, those usually controlled by men. But here at the AFO, Thea was a firecracker. She'd learned to use her womanly wiles to her advantage, cunningly twisting her desires from the sexist middle-aged men who had so often blocked her path and pushed her down because of her gender and appearance. A well-placed smile, and fluttered lash worked wonders when juxtaposed with a firm voice and no bullshit personality. And she'd been rewarded with a high and reputable station. Julian himself had backed her rise to the head of development and distribution for Crown Technology, a piece of tech that the board was very interested in seeing come to fruition. These devices have been approved by the board and are ready to be rolled out, Thea directed her statement to all three men, gesturing to the holographic vision of the attested technology device which had been developed from the Crown Tech. Development that emanated from the projector at the midpoint of the table. The device looked similar to a stainless steel headband that wrapped around the front of the forehead like a crown, except this crown dipped its metal tentacles over the temple and behind the ear. Julian himself had worn the device once, allowing Thea to demonstrate the technology. He felt firsthand how the metal conformed tightly to the shape of the skull and connected neurologically into the brain, latching onto the human host like a parasite. Once applied, it was almost impossible to remove the device without the correct measures, or unless the host died. Julian eyed the rotating hologram with a vague fascination as Thea continued. We don't need to be wasting time and resources trialing candidates when... Lawrence cut her off, his voice deep and resonating, its natural tone. With all due respect, Thea, the interface bid is targeted at minimizing the loss of human life. Your device has been documented to have long-term negative side effects in the neural function of your test subjects. Thea's face contorted at Lawrence's words, dislike evident on her face. She opened her mouth to retaliate. Lawrence, enough, Julian interjected. His voice was low, though the firmness in his tone made it clear the conversation was to be redirected. I'm finding it hard to remain quiet in the midst of the potential devastation of brain-frying headgear, and... He gestured to Lucian, who'd remained quiet at the foot of the board table. DNA-targeted chemical weapons. Lucian laughed a little under his breath, and Julian couldn't help but sense the danger behind the chuckle. And a multi-award-winning chemical scientist who'd started out in medicine before working his way into the organization in his late 30s. A consequence of inventing an inoculation that facilitated DNA recalibration in those with genetic autoimmune conditions. The process had included incorporating preconditioned stem cells from cloned pigs into a mixture of specifically developed steroid. Though Lucian was now older, he was also wiser, yet still retained the ambition and overwhelming arrogance of a young man. Often the organization had been forced to hold Lucian back from his more gruesome experiments. Lucian's focus had always been to chase scientific solutions at playing God, no matter the cost. And Lucian hadn't always contained those skills to the laboratory. Julian watched on as Lucian countered Lawrence, disregarding Julian's earlier warning. Lawrence, you want to talk prevention and loss of life. Neurotech targets the immediate threat. We can take out a terrorist in a busy street without harming a single hair on the mummies and bubs around them. In theory, Lucian, Julian reminded him. Lucian twitched a smile in response. For now. Sensing the sway and attention from her bid, Thea resumed her point. The interface bid has already been permitted 2 extensions to its timeline. If you can't even find the candidates, what hope does the technology have of actually being rolled out? She raised defiant eyes to Julian's. There were whispers amongst the organization and its board that Julian favored the interface bid above all others because of his relationship with Frey. Though nothing could be proved, of course. The truth was that Julian did favor the interface bid, because it was the AFO's best chance of attaining the right technology to meet their requirements. The interface bid was the best choice for the organization supporting Freya, and the team had been a bonus. Until now, when Freya's team were cusping the edge of a 5-year run in the circuit games, their bid still unable to meet the board's protocol. Julian had been left at a standstill with the technology, waiting on bated breath as the circuit games ran closer and closer to an end. Their bid was quickly running out of time. Julian eyed Thea as she opened her mouth to speak again, a threat to his well-laid plans. I moved to have the interface bid removed from the board's consideration. He inclined his head under her stare. You believe Crown Tech to be the most secure choice? Thea didn't hesitate. Clearly. Julian quirked an eyebrow at Thea's tone dripping with undermine. He picked up a small black remote that was laid out on the holographic device and clicked it. The hologram morphed into footage of a busy corridor with colored lights flashing at the edge of the frame. A burly, tattooed man charged through groups of people who shrank from the man's approach. The man's attempted attack on Wyatt only to be floored by Issiah. The action of the assailant caused Julian to bubble inwardly with satisfaction, though his face continued to be masked with his usual aloof coldness. He paused the footage and zoomed in, focusing on Thea's crown tech device, very visibly situated on the attacker's head. Clearly, crown tech security needs to be revisited before it is to be considered as a viable candidate for the bid. Thea drew in a breath through her nose. Her nostrils flared either side, reminding Julian of a dragon about to unleash hellfire. He couldn't deny that she looked shocked by the footage. Thea's eyes sprang to Lucian. "This looks like a setup, if ever I've seen one." Lucian didn't balk from the accusation. "Them's fighting words, Thea." His Australian drawl twanged on the swaggering words. From his seat, Lawrence stayed quiet, eyes darting between the two before raising an eyebrow at Julian. "Enough!" Julian exclaimed. "If the interface bid fails to find a viable candidate by the end of the allocated extension, then the board will make its decision." He looked pointedly at Lucian and Thea, flicking his head in the discretion of the boardroom's exit. "You're both dismissed." Thea was wordless as she rose from her seat and left, but Lucian dawdled. He glanced at the frozen hologram and whistled arrogantly, gesturing with his hand a quick fall. His whistle switched to imitate an explosion. Before he fully exited, he left Julian and Lawrence with a wink. Annoyed by Lucian's antics, Julian flashed a stern gaze on Lawrence, daring him to act out too. But Lawrence only shook his head under Julian's attention. "Don't give me that look." Lawrence started, shifting his large body in the leather chair. "You hired me to keep this organization in check, not to sit quietly in the corner with my thumb up my ass." A smirk played at the corners of Julian's mouth. This is why offers of employment should never be made under the influence. Lawrence stared on, unamused. "Don't let those two get under your skin, Lawrence," Julian continued. "The bid is solid." A moment of silence ensued as Lawrence considered his next words carefully, probably measuring how far exactly he could push Julian with his frankness. "Unless," he began. "Unless Frey can't find another candidate. Then we're all 20 different shades of screwed." There. Lawrence had gathered the balls to say what Julian had always shut down when raised by others. He'd always been a firm believer that the universe would deliver whatever you put into the world for it to hear or understand. Julian despised the fact that Lawrence was forcing him to address the issue so opening between them now. He cleared his throat and met Lawrence's eyes with the candidate he reserved for a few. "She's a great agent. She'll come through with a great solution." "They're all great agents, Julian." The challenge was clear in Lawrence's voice. "They're an incredible team. That's why you have embedded them in the first place. Do you have a point, Lawrence?" Across the table, Lawrence folded his arms, exhaling an impatient sigh. "Here it is," he paused, eyes boring into Julian's. "Take care of your own." Julian hardened his gaze at the disbelief of Lawrence's statement as it filled his core, as if Julian had ever done anything other than look after them. As if his every action wasn't to take care of them all. But Julian didn't tell Lawrence any of that. Instead, he simply replied, "Always," and watched as the man across the table let out a breath of relief. Lucian had barely closed the boardroom door and stepped out into the long hallway when Thea, who'd been hovering nearby, turned on him viciously. "You son of a bitch," she cursed. "You stole my tech and used it in the field without my consent." Lucian shook his head, amused. "Keep your wig on, Thea. I didn't touch your tech." She narrowed her eyes, judging the twinge in the corner of Lucian's lip and the controlled, boring stare he threw her way. No? No, Thea wasn't stupid enough to believe him. Well, who the hell else would release that thug into their operation? Lucian shrugged his shoulders dismissively. Might be another play from Julian to favor the interface bid. He dangled his words before her like a carrot on a fishing rod. As Thea's face transformed with blatant shock as she considered his statement, Lucian unleashed a rough laugh and continued. "Good luck proving it, though." The inside of Thea's mind whirled. Once said, Lucian couldn't take his opinion back, nor stop the penetration of their meaning into the gray matter of her thoughts. A little incessant voice whispered to her that Lucian could have a point. Julian, their fearless leader, the man who was prepared to do whatever it took to have his way for the greater good. A semblance of Thea's thoughts must have flickered across her face because Lucian started again. What are you so stressed about anyway? He asked curiously. They can't find a candidate. They're about to lose the bid. Thea raised her eyebrows. I'll put money on them bringing that boy back and giving him another shot to place. Lucian sucked in a breath. Then eyed her suspiciously. And where'd you get an idea like that? Aware she caught him in her net, she tightened her lips nonchalantly. His gameplay statistics are rumored to be quite impressive. It's a logical conclusion. Lucian, face blank, took a half step around her as if intending to pace. He stopped himself short and turned back to her. He saw right through her. Someone tipped you off. Thea let out an unladylike snort, feigning amusement, knowing she should have kept her mouth shut. Nonsense. All right, bury your bone, Lucian sighed, changing tactics. Can they even do that? Thea reflected on all the things she'd known Julian to have given Frey a free pass on. The little loopholes he'd found for her when she crossed the lines with her dangerous biotech experiments. The brashness of Frey and Jasper's words to those on the board, saying whatever they goddamn felt like, completely disrespectful in the way that Julian always tolerated their act first, receive permission later attitude. Julian's golden children, Thea stated, rolling the phrase off her tongue. What do you think? Lucian paused, processing her words, then in a low voice he uttered, Well, that can't happen. The scientist met Thea's eyes, taking the time to clear his throat before speaking again. How would you feel about a temporary partnership? Thea took in the graying hair and ingrained lines on Lucian's face. A man no longer in his prime, that was sure, but Lucian was a man more intelligent than she'd ever met, with years of calculation and a coldness she didn't really possess herself. Would never possess, in fact. Could she really lower herself to partner with a man like Lucian? For so long as she'd been with the AFO, the two had been on opposite sides of the same coin, and frankly, Lucian was Thea's biggest pain in the ass in the boardroom. But Julian was a leader, because of the hard and sometimes unethical decisions he made on an almost daily basis. And now it was time for Thea to follow suit, providing Lucian was prepared to play along with her moral compass. She opened her mouth to answer Lucian's proposal. When the boardroom door swung open and Lawrence joined them in the hallway, though Lawrence's wary eyes were telling them that he had clocked the lingering conversation between Thea and Lucian, he remained mute and simply smiled politely before moving down the hall. Thea waited until Lawrence was completely out of sight before returning to Lucian. Are you willing to play by the rules? Lucian's face contorted into the arrogant sneer Thea despised, her last signal that maybe she was going down a rabbit hole she might not be able to climb back out of. Sure, Lucian answered slowly. If they work. The main office at Lion Insurance was abuzz with mid-morning activity. Around him, Wyatt could hear the monotonous voices of multiple customer service workers drawling into the phone mouthpieces from their evenly spaced desks. From the water cooler in the room's corner, Wyatt spotted Lance, his aging, pot-bellied boss, deep in conversation with his assistant, Michelle. It was a rather plain, middle-aged woman with a no-nonsense personality that Wyatt would more candidly describe as bitchy. Sometimes Wyatt found himself feeling mildly empathetic for Lance. Michelle, in all her underwhelming physical glory and snarky attitude, was clearly the wife-approved choice decided by Lance's other half. Too bad his wife didn't seem as equally mindful of Lance's mental health as he was for hers. A loud bang from across the office drew Lance's glare over to the communal printer, and Wyatt's eyes followed too. Justin, a colleague of Greg's, had clearly given the printer a thump in frustration. Wyatt watched as Justin threw Lance a sheepish grin before retreating back to his desk. As Wyatt realized there would be no dramatic consequences for Justin, he averted his gaze back to his own, or more precisely, the crown-shaped piece of hardware that was dumped on top of it, in pride of place. Wyatt knew that the hardware was another clue, another doorway into the world he barely grasped in his soft, slender coder's fingers. There had to be a way to turn it on. Had to be a way to force that door open. A desperate man, Wyatt dug into the contents of his desk drawers for compatible attachments or leads, emerging frustratingly empty-handed. He thumbed through the yellow manila folders piled on the far side of his desk, just in case he'd wedged something in there of any kind of use. To Wyatt's surprise, a white envelope dropped out from between the cardboard, hitting the carpeted floor with a soft thud. Wyatt bent from his swivel chair to retrieve it, twisting it in his fingers. Addressed to Wyatt Hawkins and of average size, just like a utility bill that he'd usually ignore. The envelope seemed regular enough until he noticed that it was sealed with an ink stamp that read, Crown-Tech Pty Ltd. Wyatt turned the envelope over again, looking for further clues, feeling like the appearance of the envelope had suddenly launched him into the cusp of the hyper-reality he'd just been dumped from. Dread and excitement stirred inside Wyatt's belly. Could the letter be from Frey? Jasper or Fergus? Could one of them possibly be feeding him a clue to find them another way in? Wyatt tore the envelope open with jittering hands and unfolded the document within. The letter was short, typed rather than written, and printed on an A4 page. Wyatt Hawkins, we are aware of your recent acquisition of a piece of technology belonging to our company. We'd like to set up a meeting at your earliest convenience to retain the device. Please call 07412-134-07 to discuss. Kind regards, Crown-Tech Pty Ltd. Wyatt reread the letter 3 times, enough to feed the roiling in his stomach that had formed a pit. The letter wasn't from his team. His kidnappers, Wyatt tried to remind himself. Dragging his keyboard across towards him, Wyatt punched in Crown-Tech Pty Ltd. into the Google search engine displayed on his monitor and hit enter, tapping his fingers anxiously as the results loaded. Within seconds, Google had created a list starting with records from ASIC, showing that no private company by the name Crown-Tech Pty Ltd. Was registered in their database. In fact, there looked to be no immediate clear results that appeared matching the company at all. Wyatt didn't know where the letter had come from, but if it wasn't them, and if he couldn't find the company online, which indicated the company didn't exist, Wyatt began to feel sick. The more he thought about it, the more he considered that this was probably just one of Greg's practical jokes. Greg had probably seen him staring at the circuitry. That asshole probably hadn't even been able to help himself. With a sigh, Wyatt crumpled up the letter into a ball, along with the envelope, and tossed it into the waste bin under his desk. His eyes returned to the hardware before him. Wyatt? Earth to Wyatt? An annoyed, semi-aggressive voice demanded from Wyatt's right, breaking through his focus. Wyatt turned his swivel chair in the voice's direction and found himself face to face with Lance, who donned a worn grimace to match his tired blue suit. Sorry, late night, Wyatt offered bleakly by way of apology. Lance's lips tightened into a thin, disapproving line. Exhausted from recuperation, are we? The man's voice was laden with challenge as he dropped a thick binder onto Wyatt's desk heavily, drawing the attention of other nearby office workers. Wyatt felt unwanted heat rise in his cheeks. Lance continued, narrowing in on Wyatt's humiliation. Your co-workers volunteered you for proofing in your absence. Highlight and investigate every record malfunction from June to August and have it on my desk by 4. Wyatt's shoulders visibly dropped. Malfunctions, he questioned, his voice a flat monotone. Lance raised his eyebrows at Wyatt's insolence. Yes, malfunctions, he snapped. Way too many claims were approved. Heaven forbid those little old ladies have their claims processed. Wyatt muttered under his breath, knowing he was pushing Lance too far but unable to stop himself. Lance stared down at Wyatt, and Wyatt was surprised to see the man looked more tired than angry. What? He questioned, almost giving Wyatt room to deny his disrespect. Wyatt took the bait. Nothing. Lance turned to leave, relief evident underneath the sternness of his expression, the tension leaving his tall frame. Wyatt hunched over the binder and began flicking through the data pages. And Wyatt? Lance's voice sounded through the office. One last little throwdown of dominance. Wyatt raised his head in response. At least pretend to be awake, would you? Lance scolded before stalking off into his office.
Tango hairs around your neck will hang you out to dry in Hollywood.
You have been listening to episode 6 of Interface, the Creator's Champion. This series is a Red Empire production and a Sound Vision Gold Coast original production, and has been written by Amy Casey, Ellie Popov, and Simon Kennedy.
This series is produced by Amy Casey and Roberto Mellini. Executive produced by myself, Charles Jazz Terrier, Ellie Popov, Steve Chickerell, Wade Boys, and Sherry Hamrick-Rowell. It is co-produced by Alex Contis and Tom Cramsie. Editing, sound design, and music is done by Roberto Mellini and Tom Cramsie. Our production partners are the scandalous, but always effervescent Organic Media Group, and that theme song you keep hearing belongs to my co-host, Ellie Popov.
As you return to your mundane little lives, listeners, my advice to you all is to keep track of our next episode drop. Future information about the series can be found at www.redempireproductions.com. And don't forget to follow and subscribe to us via whatever streaming platform you're listening to us on. Join us again. Live beyond your understanding.
Mark my words, I'll find the light.